In this lecture, we will give an introduction to Hebrew poetry in preparation for studying the Poetic and the Prophetic books. How much of the Old Testament is poetic? Well, there are 6 books that are sometimes labeled poetic books: Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs, all of which occur together in our English Bibles, to which one could add Lamentations, though in our Bibles it's placed after Jeremiah. The prophetic books also have a great deal of poetry. Isaiah, Hosea, Joel, Amos are all mostly written in poetry. And there's poetry here and there in the historical books as well. Whole chapters like Genesis 49, when Jacob blesses his children, and Exodus 15, the Song of Moses, and Judges chapter 5, the victory song of Deborah, are all primarily written in poetry. So even in the more prose section of the Bible, you get a lot of poetry here and there, but particularly the poetic books and the prophetic books will have even more. In fact, they estimate somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the Old Testament is written in poetry. Well, what are the characteristics of Hebrew poetry? Well, Hebrew poetry is going to be different than typical English poetry because it lacks the 2 features that we normally associate with poetry, either rhyme or meter. Well, Hebrew poetry lacks both rhyme and meter. The distinctive feature of Hebrew poetry is a phenomenon known as parallelism. So maybe the best way to get into the idea of parallelism is to look at some specific examples. The examples that follow do not exhaust the number of categories that there are. Indeed, the number of variations of parallelism are pretty much innumerable. I've seen books that show 30 or 40 different types, but I'll give you at least a few types to give you the idea. The most basic type of parallelism would be synonymous parallelism. This is where the same thought is repeated in the next line of poetry using different but synonymous words. For example, in Psalm 105 and verse 23, it says, "Then Israel came to Egypt, Jacob sojourned in the land of Ham." Well, you can see the parallelism. Parallel with Israel will be Jacob. Israel and Jacob are 2 names for the same patriarch, and both here are used for the descendants of Jacob and the descendants of Israel. Egypt is parallel in this case with the land of Ham. Ham was one of the 3 sons of Noah. His descendants ended up settling primarily in Africa. And so Egypt and land of Ham are, in this context at least, synonyms, although Egypt would be a smaller portion of the land of Ham. It'd be like United States of America and North America. But nonetheless, here it serves the function of synonym. And so then Israel came to Egypt, Jacob sojourned in the land of Ham. Both lines say more or less the same thing, and that would be synonymous parallelism. The next category is antithetical parallelism. Antithetical parallelism balances parallel lines through opposite or contrasts of thought and tends to use antonyms as opposed to synonyms. Example from Psalm 90 and verse 6, speaking of grass, comparing grass with human beings. In the morning the grass, flourishes and is renewed. In the evening it fades and withers. So opposite of morning would be evening. Opposite of flourishing would be fading. Opposite of a plant being renewed is a plant withering. And so it's making a contrast between the first line of poetry and the second line of poetry, emphasizing opposite words or antonyms. Another category of parallelism is emblematic parallelism. Emblematic parallelism involves a simile, or in some cases a metaphor, so that the thought of the first line is compared with the thought in the second line. Example, as a father pities his children, so the Lord pities those who fear him. Now, it doesn't say the same thing twice. That would be synonymous parallelism. But it does compare the things said in the first line of poetry with the things said in the second line of poetry. So just as a father will have compassion on his children, so Yahweh, who's like a father, will have compassion on those who fear him. Those who fear the Lord are like his children. And so it involves a simile or a metaphor, and therefore it is called emblematic parallelism. Then there's a category known as incomplete parallelism. Incomplete parallelism is parallelism in which each line has the same number of terms, at least in the Hebrew, but only some of the terms parallel. An example of this, you will destroy their offspring from the earth and their children from among the sons of men. Now, parallel with their offspring is their children. Parallel with from the earth is from among the sons of men. But there's nothing parallel in the second line of poetry with you will destroy. The verb is left out, assumed, but left out. Now you could have made it synonymous parallelism by adding a verb in the second line of poetry. You will destroy their offspring from the earth. You will wipe out their children from among the sons of men. Well, that would have been synonymous parallelism. But in this case, it is incomplete parallelism. If you label things, you will destroy element A, their offspring, element B, from the earth, element C, well, then there'd be a B prime, their children, and a C prime from among the sons of men, but there'd be no A prime in the second line of poetry. Another category of parallelism is stair-step parallelism. These especially come in triplicates. It shows progression of thought, repeating part of the previous line, but extending that idea with each successive line. Again, this is best understood by looking at an example. In Psalm 29 and verse 1, ascribe to the Lord, O heavenly beings. Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Ascribe to the Lord the glory of his name. Now, in each line of poetry, you have ascribe to the Lord, ascribe to the Lord, ascribe to the Lord. But then you keep adding ideas to the mix. So ascribe to the Lord who? O heavenly beings. Ascribe to the Lord what? Glory and strength. Ascribe to the Lord how much? The glory of his name, or the glory his name deserves. So each line adds something, the who, the what, and the how much, you might say. And so none of the lines are strictly synonymously parallel, but clearly there's parallelism going on. And since with each line you kind of go up a step, go up a step, go up a step, they call that stair-step parallelism, by adding ideas with each line of poetry. The next category is chiasm or chiastic parallelism. And we've seen chiasm as a structuring device in certain passages already. Chiastic parallelism is like other kinds of parallelism, except there is an inversion of order of items in the second line. One clear example of that would be Psalm 51 and verse 1. Have mercy upon me, O God, according to your steadfast love, according to your abundant mercy, blot out my transgressions. Now, in the first line of poetry, you say, have mercy. What you mean by that is blot out my transgressions. And both have that prepositional phrase, according to thy steadfast love, according to thy abundant mercy. But notice that the order is different. You have A, B in the first line, but then B prime, A prime in the second line. So the same ideas, so it's like synonymous parallelism, but in the second line of poetry, the ideas shift order. Now this can even get more complicated, although usually it doesn't show up in English translation. I might comment that parallelism translates better than, say, rhyme does. It's very hard to take something that rhymes in one language and translate it into something that rhymes but still has the same kind of meaning in another language. But with parallelism, that actually can work pretty well, going from one language to another. But when it gets complicated, sometimes the translators don't follow the parallelism. But here's an example. He counts the number for the stars, for all of them names he calls out. That's kind of a literalistic translation of Psalm 147:4. And you get an A, B, C, C prime, B prime, A prime pattern, where he calls out is parallel with he counts. The number and the names are parallel, and the prepositional phrase for the stars, for all of them, are parallel. Doesn't translate well, but it is a more complicated A, B, C, C, B, A type of chiastic parallelism. And then the last category I'll mention, even though there are many other types of categories, is synthetic parallelism. That's where you have matched pairs of line but no real parallelism. It's kind of a strange category. My example is, but as for me, I have installed my king upon Zion, my holy mountain. First line of poetry here, second line of poetry there. But there's really no parallelism. So how is that actually functioning? Well, if you go back to Psalm 2, you find that there's a lot of parallelism up until this point. Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? Nations raging, people plotting, parallel. Kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers take counsel together. Again, kings and rulers taking their stand, taking counsel against the Lord and against his anointed, God and his closely associated king. Let us burst their bonds apart and cast their cords from us. Again, synonymous parallelism. He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. Again, parallelism. He will speak to them in his wrath, terrify them in his fury. Again, parallelism. But then when you get to verse 6, but as for me, I have installed my king upon Zion, my holy mountain. There is no parallelism there. That would be synthetic parallelism, and it's bringing a whole discussion to kind of a climax, you might say, in this case. Not always, but that's what it can do.